Well,
Mute the screen.
here we are again,
Mute the screen.
the 11th day, the 11th month. It was at first known as Armistice Day because it ended the Great War, the war that ended on this day in 1918. But it has become Veterans Day because the Great War was not the war to end all wars. At the end of May, when you and I are getting ready for exams, and our city is getting ready for the 500-mile race, we remember those soldiers who died in our service, Memorial Day. But today, at the beginning of a time of year that is cold and often gray, we do not only remember those who gave their lives, but also those, like our Dr. Vesper, who offered their lives, but who returned to us. And we give thanks. I repeat myself on days like this one. My colleagues have heard all these quotations before, and some of you have. Ever since Veterans Day 2004, when I got up the courage to remember out loud. But war is so old, and veterans, well, the word veteran comes from the Latin vetus, old, ripe, worn, belonging to the past. Veterans belong to the past. Have we not fought wars since the beginning of time? Veterans also belong to the present. Plato stated flatly that war exists because it is human nature. Fighting, not philosophy, literature, or architecture. Fighting, argued Plato, best revealed the virtues of the human soul. But on a day like today, we do not remember war, but people. We think of what we have, and in particular, who has enabled us to have what we have. We think of those who fought, that we can be where we are today. For those veterans who, for us, began in 1775. At St. Richard's, where Dr. Faley and I taught together, we read Johnny Tremaine. The Boston Observers were meeting for the last time. Sam Adams, John Adams, Paul Revere, Joseph Warren. Then they were interrupted. James Otis came in, old, slightly crazy, from being hit in the head with a brick. His arrival had interrupted Sam Adams' discussion that there would be fighting. For what will we fight? Otis asked. To get rid of the British. No, he said. No occupied city ever had better treatment than we've had. Well, to fight for the rights of Americans to be free of English taxes. No, for something more important than money. In the end, he gave them their answer. We give all we have, lives, property, safety, skills. We fight, we die for a simple thing. Only that a man can stand up. For what? For what would we stand up? For what would each of us step forward? And having stepped forward, would I step back? Would I stand steady and maybe die? Can any of us answer that question? Will we only know the answer when the moment comes, when we're asked at a time we have to act, not just talk? A few here have faced such a time, such a question, and answered it. I hope that we ask ourselves that question, for what would I step forward and risk even death? And that we think about our answers. But I also hope that life never demands an answer. Remember the soldiers of the Revolution and veterans of the Civil War. My great-grandfather served as a fireman on a Monitor. His older brother served in the cavalry. African-American regiments were raised during the Civil War. Frederick Douglass' son fought in one. The first peacetime all-black regiments were established by Congress to serve in the West. This was the 10th Cavalry, the famous Buffalo Soldiers. And veterans of World War I, two of my great-uncles fought and returned from that conflict. One, a doctor, had a grain of mustard gas up his nose. It caused his face to swell up. He instructed those nearby to steady his head with sandbags, and then he told them where to cut to let the pus out. And those Buffalo Soldiers in the West, during World War I, the United States Army was reluctant to press African Americans into combat, in spite of their decades on the Western Plains. The French Army, however, eagerly accepted anyone who volunteered. American Buffalo Soldiers, wearing the blue helmets of the French Army, fought in the trenches. 171 African Americans were awarded the French Legion of Honor. And by October 1917, several hundred African American men received officers' training and were commissioned as captains and lieutenants in the United States Army. When the New York 369th Infantry of African American troops arrived home, they had the honor of being the only regiment in World War I which never had one of their men captured and never lost a foot of ground. September 17, 2005, Mark Matthews, the oldest and last Buffalo soldier, died at the age of 111. 111. He is buried at Arlington. Remember the Buffalo Soldiers. And veterans of World War II. My father flew Spitfires in England and in North Africa in the United States Army Air Force. Also in World War II were the code talkers. Young men, sheep herders, who had never been away from their homes in America's Southwest. Young men of the Navajo Nation. 500 Navajo volunteered to serve in every Marine assault in the South Pacific between 1942 and 1945. About 50 are still alive today, most living back home on the Navajo Nation reservation that spans Arizona, New Mexico, and Utah. Those men stood up. Before they came, the enemy intercepted and sabotaged U.S. military communications at an alarming rate. They had excellent English translators. American forces devised ever more complicated codes to no avail, until the Navajo wrote the code, but wrote it in the ancient Navajo language. In the first 48 hours of the battle on Iwo Jima, 6 code talkers worked nonstop, transmitting and receiving more than 800 messages about troop movement and enemy fire. Not one message was deciphered by the enemy. Keith Little joined the Marines at age 17. He remembers crouching in a bomb crater amid heavy fire on Iwo Jima. We were never told who the original 29 Navajo were who created that code, he wrote, but I give thanks to them every day. Remember the code talkers. I just have a few words left, but when I've said them, and it is time that we go to third period, or today double fourth, I'd appreciate it if you would leave the room in silent thought. Not necessarily in mourning for those who did not return, do remember them and give thanks, but leave in laughter and rejoicing, in appreciation for what we have because of what they were willing to do and are willing to do. And today, and all tomorrows, when we tell jokes, when we study or don't study for a test, when we get a driver's license, we hear good news from a college, we hug some relative, Thanksgiving. Open that place in the back of your mind and remember that we have what we have in part because someone else stood up and stepped forward. And we'll step forward again if, God forbid, they're called. When I was a freshman in college, each freshman English class had to read something by William Faulkner. My section read Absalom, Absalom. I read it. I confess, I don't remember it at all. It wasn't until 15 years later, teaching at IUPUI, that I read him again. Wow. Faulkner died the year before I entered high school. But years before then, when he received the Nobel Prize for Literature in 1950, he spoke words that explain why we remember and memorialize. Words that explain what we hold to and what we let go. Words that explain why and for what we stand up. He spoke of his life's work as a writer who, in the agony and sweat of human spirit, seeks to create, out of the materials of the human spirit, the problems of the human heart in conflict with itself. The problems of the human heart in conflict with itself. The writer, he continued, must teach himself that the basest of all things is to be afraid. And teaching himself that, forget it forever, leaving no room for anything but the old truths of the heart, the universal truths, love and honor and pity and pride and compassion and sacrifice. I believe, Faulkner concluded, that man will not merely endure, he will prevail. He is immortal, not because he alone among creatures has an inexhaustible voice, but because he has a soul, a spirit capable of compassion and sacrifice and endurance. It is the poet's duty to write about these things. It is his privilege to help man endure by lifting his heart, by reminding him of the courage and honor and hope and pride and compassion and pity and sacrifice which have been the glory of our past. I ask you to think on these things. I ask you to remember. Remember those who stand up. And finally, I leave you with my favorite lines, written by who else? Shakespeare, from Hamlet. My favorite lines because they offer no answer. They don't tell us why we have war, but oddly enough, I think they offer us the recognition of the possibilities of endurance and even of joy. They tell us to be ready to stand. Those words, if it be now, 'tis not to come. If it be not to come, it will be now. If it be not now, yet it will come. The readiness is all. Let us give thanks for those who stand up and stand ready.